Chapter 11. Martians Don't Care. "I don't like the looks of this at all," said Lockhart finally. "I suspect a trap. Yet we've got to land and get at the base. I'm going to take the ship out into the desert beyond the city and let a scouting squad go in first." The Magellan lifted back into the sky, then moved out over the ochre wasteland that was the barren desert of the red planet. Slowly the ship dropped again until its pointed nether end hung about 20 feet above the cold shale and time-worn sand. Captain Bolton and Ferrati were selected to do the initial survey. Burl and Haines helped them climb through the packed spaces of the outer hold. The jeep was swung out to the lowermost cargo port, and the spaceship's cargo derrick lowered the compact Army vehicle to the ground. The two scouts then put on altitude suits with oxygen masks, slung walkie-talkies about their chests, took light carbines in hand and pistols in belts, and went down the rope ladder from the cargo port. They climbed into the sturdy jeep with its specially designed carburetor and pressurized engine. The vehicle had been prepared to operate in the light atmosphere of Mars, as thin as the air on a Himalayan mountain top and low in free oxygen. Burl and Haines, clad in pressure suits themselves, sat in the open port and watched the jeep set off. The engine kicked over and barked a few times in the strange air. Then Bolton at the wheel threw in the clutch, stepped on the gas, and the squat little car, painted in Air Force blue, rolled over the flat rocky surface, kicking up a light cloud of sand as it went. On Haines's lap sat a walkie-talkie. Bolton and Ferrati kept up a running commentary as they approached the city. Ferrati described the ground and the appearance of the oncoming city. The jeep was now a small object merging with the dark mounds of the city's outermost buildings. "We haven't met any Martians yet," came Ferrati's voice. "Apparently they aren't interested in investigating us even now. And here we are rolling right up to the city limits." There was a pause. The walkie-talkie emitted a series of squeaks and squawks, and Ferrati's voice came through now with distortion. "We're crossing the city limits. There's a sort of hard plastic pavement that begins at the very edge. Now we're going down an intersection between the buildings." The squawks became increasingly louder. They could hear only a word or two. Haines asked whether he was getting through to them, but he could not make out an answer because of the racket. "It's the sun tap station. It's generating distortion. We'll have to wait until they return," said Burl. Haines nodded and turned off the set which had begun to utter ear-piercing howls. The two men waited quietly for about half an hour. Only a phone call from the curious men in the control room interrupted their vigil. Then, finally, Burl spotted a little cloud of dust on the horizon. "There they are." The two men stood up as the little jeep made its way back over the desert to the ship. As it drew closer, they saw a third occupant sitting in the back with Ferrati. Haines opened the walkie-talkie. "Wait till you see this fellow," Ferrati's comment came through. The jeep drew up to the ship and stopped. Ferrati waved them down. A few seconds later they were joined by Lockhart and Clyde, also in pressure suits. The creature in the back of the jeep was a Martian. They stared in fascination. It was about 3 feet long, with a small, oval-shaped head and two very large, many-faceted eyes. A small beak-like mouth and short, stubby antennae completed its face. The head was attached by a short neck to a body that consisted of 3 oval masses joined together by narrow belts, much like the joints of an insect. A pair of arms, ending in long 3-fingered hands, grew from the first segment. A set of long, thin legs grew out of each of the 2 other segments. A glistening grayish-blue shell, its skin, covered it from head to foot. At the moment, this particular Martian was tightly restrained by a strong nylon net, and was obviously the captive of the 2 explorers. "Why, it looks like a giant insect," exclaimed Burl. "More like a kind of lobster," was Ferretti's answer. "But this is it. This is one of the city dwellers." Lockhart shook his head. "I don't like this. We shouldn't do anything to antagonize the Martians. Taking one prisoner like this may be a bad first move." Bolton stepped out of the jeep. There wasn't anything else we could do. Besides, who said Martians were ever our friends? "We got into the city," he went on, "and drove around the streets. There were plenty of these fellows around, going about their business, hundreds of them. Do you think they stopped to look at us? Do you think they were curious? Do you think they talked to us, called the police, did anything at all? No," he answered himself. "They just walked around us as if we were a stick of something in the way. They don't say anything to each other. They just go on about their affairs, dragging things, carrying food, hurting young ones, and not a darn word. They looked at us and didn't even act as if they saw us. When we stopped one, it squirmed out of our grasp and walked away. Finally we took this fellow, simply grabbed him off the street, tied him up, stuffed him in the jeep, and kidnapped him. And do you think anybody cared or turned in an alarm or tried to help him? No." Lockhart looked at the prisoner a moment. The Martian stared at him out of his unwinking multiple eyes. "Are you sure these are the engineers of the canals, the builders?" Bolton nodded. "Definitely. We saw some of them at work. They were repairing a house, and they use tools and fire. They have machines, and they use them. They've got their city working and well laid out, but I don't know how they do it. They must communicate in some way, but they act as if they had been drilled in their jobs and were going through an elaborate and complicated pantomime. Even the young don't utter a peep." Lockhart stepped back a bit. "Untie this fellow. Let's see what he does." When the Martian had been released from the enveloping net, it made no effort to communicate. It turned slowly around, a little wobbly at first, and wandered off, paying no attention to the men, the ship, or the jeep. Then it started walking at a rapid pace. The men watched as it trotted into the desert, away from the city. It seemed to wander around as if lost, and then set out in another direction, but still one that would not take it to the city, which was quite plainly in view. The Martian disappeared from view behind a series of small hummocks, still bound for nowhere. The men were lost in amazement. Russell Clyde uttered a low whistle. "Burl's right. It must be a sort of insect." "This whole civilization seems to be insect-like, if you ask me," said Burl. "It's like a huge ant-hill or a big beehive. It seems complicated, and the creatures go through complex activities, and all the time it's something they were born with." Ferrati nodded. "Now that you mention it, that's exactly what the city was like. Nobody gave orders. Everybody just did what they were supposed to do. Nobody was curious about us because it wasn't their business." "And individually, they haven't intelligence," Clyde added. "That one, the one you took away from his work, plainly is lost. He doesn't know how to go about getting back. He has no curiosity about us. He may not even have much of a brain. Individual ants have no brain, only a sort of central nervous center. Collectively, they perform wonders. Individually, they are quite helpless." Lockhart interrupted the discussion. "Well then, let's get on with it. Obviously, the Sun-Tap builders placed their station in this city because it was a safe spot, protected by the Martians themselves, and because the Martians would never think to interfere with them. So you men can go back, take your stuff, dig out the station, and put it out of commission. Get going." Haynes and Burl climbed into the jeep with Bolton and Ferrati. Russell Clyde insisted on joining them, and Lockhart gave his consent. Off they went, rumbling over the sand toward the city of instinct. Burl was excited and curious about the Martians. They presented a strange mixture of contradictions. How, he asked Russ, could they have built a worldwide network of canals, set up pumping stations, laid out plantations, mastered hydraulic and power engineering, if they are mere creatures of instinct? Surely there must be brainy ones somewhere, a thinker's species." "Not necessarily," said Russ. "Remember, these creatures are operating without opposition. They are really the highest type of life here. The need to conserve water and to continue their hive life forced them to learn a practical kind of engineering. Nobody knows how the ants and bees form their complex societies. There are none among them with any larger brains than the rest, and they do not talk. But somehow ants and bees communicate, and somehow they act as a mass. Figure it on a worldwide scale, driven by the threat of their world drying up, and these creatures built up a mechanical civilization to meet it. But it also accounts for why they have never flown, not through the air and not through space, why they haven't attempted radio communication with Earth, and why they don't understand what the Sun Tap station is doing to them. Their world is being killed, and they literally haven't the brains to understand it." They reached the city. All about was a silent hustle and bustle of enigmatic, shining, shelled creatures. Superficially, it looked like an intelligent civilization. There were wheeled carts, driven by some sort of steam generator. Steam-driven engines ran factories. The Martians made way for the jeep with unconcern. Never had they seen creatures as large as themselves that were not of their own kind on hive business. Hence, none such could exist. This was a world totally without individualism, a civilization without a spoken language, without names, without banners. Wherever or however the mass knowledge was located or transmitted, no individual of another species could ever hope to know. It would be forever as remote from human explorers as the farthest star on the farthest galaxy. They drove to where the sun-tapped masts rose from the ground. The men parked the jeep out of the way of the silent traffic, climbed out, and walked into the rounded door of a building. Its architecture was not like that of the other buildings. Inside, the chambers were dark. "These creatures have no lights," remarked Bolton. "They must use their feelers indoors." "Ah, but look," said Burl, reaching out a hand to a little globe set on a pole in the floor. He touched it, and the globe lighted up. The sun-tap builders needed light and put in their own fixtures here. I recognize their style. The 5 men followed a hallway that sloped down into the ground and came out into a large underground cellar several 100 feet wide. It was the sun-tap station. There were now the familiar globes and rods, the force fields, the controls, the pedestals, and the ends of the rotating masts. They made their recordings, and Burl got ready to turn off the station. Ferrati and Haynes uncrated a small, tactical, atomic bomb they had carried with them, one of the smallest perfected by the Army during the past half-dozen years. They laid it down in the center of the equipment and set the timer for a half-hour away. Bolton found the alarm globe and prepared to blow it up. Then Burl took the control panel and switched off the station. They heard the thud of a crumbling mast. Bolton fired a shot into the alarm globe, which had begun to turn red. It smashed. "All right, men," snapped Haynes. "Let's go." As they moved toward the exit, Bolton hesitated. "Hey," he said, "there's one globe still in action." The others turned in time to see Bolton stride over to a very small globe which was glowing pale yellow against the wall near the doorway. The Marine captain drew his pistol, aimed, and fired. The globe burst, but as it did so, a level bolt of yellow light shot back along the path of the bullet. For a split second, Bolton was outlined in yellow fire. There was a flash like lightning. Each man reached for his weapons, but the underground station remained dark and dead. Their flashlights turned on Bolton. The stocky Marine was lying on the ground. They ran to him. "He's alive!" cried Haynes, as he saw that Bolton was still breathing, his breath whistling back and forth through the oxygen mask. Quickly, Haynes examined him. His heart's all right. He's just been knocked unconscious." Ferrati and Haines picked up the captain by his arms and legs. Though he would have been heavy on Earth, his weight on Mars was very slight, and each man knew he was capable of carrying great loads with his Earth-attuned muscles. Then, in single file, they left the cellar and came out of the doorway of the building. As they emerged, they were stopped short. Surrounding them was a tremendous and growing crowd of Martians. A solid wall of shell-like faces stared at them, and a small forest of short antennae waved and flickered in great agitation. As they pushed their way with great difficulty toward the jeep, the crowd began to sway as if in anger. Now, for the first time, they heard the creatures make a noise, a sort of humming and buzzing, like angered bees. "They see us now," muttered Haines. "I don't like it." "The Sun-Tap builders did it," said Burl. "They must have booby-trapped the place against intruders. That globe that got Bolton must have set off some sort of vibration that enrages these creatures, and it looks as if we're the victims." As they reached their jeep, the encircling mass of Martians moved forward. The humming rose to a higher pitch, and then the mob, with the berserk ferocity of a swarm of bees, lunged toward them. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. At Rope's End. With Bolton lying across the back seat, the four men acted simultaneously. Thinking only of self-defense, they drew their pistols and fired point-blank into the monsters attacking them. As the men emptied their guns, the Martians in front stumbled, fell, rolled over, or began to run aimlessly as the heavy slugs tore through them. They were not easy to kill, which was to be expected of creatures without much of a central consciousness, but on the other hand, once struck or injured, they seemed to lose contact with their fellows and to act wholly without direction. They plunged wildly into each other, and before the men in the jeep had finished their barrage, the clearing was a milling, confused mob. Body clashed against body, legs scrambled under legs, and the angry buzz was now lost amid the clattering and banging of shell against shell. Haines slid into the front seat behind the steering wheel, stepped on the gas, and drove toward a momentary gap in the mob. The jeep tore through, raced around the corner, and headed down an empty street. Crouching in the back, Burl, Russ, and Ferrati hastily reloaded. "We can't let ourselves get stopped or even hole up. That A-bomb is going to go off in about 20 minutes, and we'd better be back at the ship before then," cried Russ. As they bumped along, they noticed that the Martians who came within 50 feet of their jeep suddenly stopped whatever they were doing and turned toward them, hostile. They were like a stick drawn along among bees. As they traveled, they left fury in their wake. "It must be Bolton," Russ yelled to Burl above the roar of their passage. "He must be charged with an irritating vibration." Burl nodded as he looked back. The Martians had started after them on foot and could lope fast when they wanted to. "They've got some sort of organized action going," he called to Haines. "I think it's steam carts." "The mass mine caught on fast," said Russ. "And look, they're warned in advance now." They were nearing the edge of the city, and looming before them, blocking the right-of-way, were two steam carts, big ones, carrying a large number of Martians. They were holding metallic rods and instruments in their hand members. Ferrati opened a chest built against the back of the seat and took out a light machine gun. Climbing into the front next to Haines, he kneeled down behind the windshield, raised the gun, and blazed away. The steam carts suddenly swerved, one after the other, ran wildly into the side of a building, and turned over. The jeep roared past them, raced across the last 100 feet of city paving and out onto the desert. Haines had to slow down to navigate safely the uneven layers of barren soil, rock, and sand. Burl holstered his gun and reached across for one of the abandoned walkie-talkies. In the excitement of their exit, no one had noticed the change in the Martian scenery, but now it occurred to Burl that the day was distinctly lighter, and he fancied the sun, small though it was, felt warmer. The sun tap demolished, this was to be expected, and by the same token, radio communication should now be practical. Sure enough, he got Lockhart's voice at once. Hastily, he warned the commander of what had happened. As they drew nearer the Magellan, the great spaceship lowered toward the ground and let down its grapples and ladders. Burl saw that there was no time to be lost. A stream of Martians and steam carts was pouring out of the city on their trail. They reached the spaceship and slammed to a halt. The men leaped out. Burl and Russ lifted Bolton's unconscious body from the jeep, and between them managed to hoist him awkwardly up the dangling rope ladder. The others hooked grapples onto the jeep, and when it was secure, leaped for safety themselves. As the first of the Martian steam carts was almost on them, the Magellan lifted into the air. It rose high above the surface and swung off into the desert. The Martians drew to a halt. Burl, looking down from the doorway of the cargo hatch, could see them milling aimlessly around. None, he noticed, ever glanced up. Air flight, apparently, was an inconceivable phenomenon to them. After the jeep had been pulled into the cargo hold and secured, the outer ports were sealed. When everyone was safely in the inner sphere, the Magellan drew away from Mars and started on the next lap of its long mission. Bolton was carefully examined. Nothing could be made of his condition. He seemed to bear no physical hurt, although he slept on. He was placed in his bunk, and there he rested, breathing slowly, temperature normal, dormant. The life of the spaceship resumed for the time being without him. The next port of call was Jupiter, and that presented problems of its own. Between Mars and Jupiter was the great asteroid belt, a region of many thousands of tiny planetoids ranging in size from worldlets of 200 or 300 miles in diameter down to rocks the size of footballs. The debris of an exploded planet, was the comment Russ made to Burl. That's the most likely explanation. Anyway, he added, there seems to be no sun-tap station on any of them. The next one is beyond the asteroids, in Jupiter's orbit. During the next few days, Lockhart and the two astrogators were busy working out a rather complex maneuver, which consisted of having the ship jump over the asteroid belt rather than travel directly through it. While the orbits of thousands of the larger asteroids had been charted, there were thousands more that consisted of just chunks of rock too small to notice. They could not chance a collision with any one of these. Yet, to work out the whereabouts of them all was impossibly time-consuming. What the Magellan did was to depart from the plane of the ecliptic, that level around the sun to which all planets generally adhere, and to draw outward so as to avoid the path of the asteroids, then come back in onto the orbit and plane of Jupiter. This involved some tricky work with the various gravitational lines, using Mars and the sun for repulsion and certain stars for attraction. There were quite a number of gravity shifts, and during this period no one could be quite sure what his weight would be from one moment to another. There were several periods of zero gravity, when the crew members would float and face the complex annoyances of a steady feeling of free fall. Burl, after a couple of such sessions, got the hang of it rather comfortably. Lockhart looked at him oddly and smiled. Glad to know it. I may have a task for you soon, then. Others found the weightless condition not so bearable. One of the engineering crew, Detmar, had to be hospitalized. What he had resembled severe seasickness. Oberfield also experienced moments of acute upset. Bolton's condition did not change. Once or twice he stirred slightly in his sleep and seemed to murmur something, but then he would lapse back into his coma. Fortunately, he did not resist food and did swallow liquids forced into his mouth. Except for one or two rare intervals, communication with Earth had ceased. Besides, the mother world was now moving away from them, and would pass behind the sun. Efforts to obtain medical advice for Bolton proved futile. After they had passed the orbital line of the asteroids and had rearranged their drive so that they were falling freely toward Jupiter, Lockhart called the exploring crew together. "I've got a job for you men," he announced. Haines, Ferrati, and Burl gathered about the control board to listen. They were restless for something to do. Plans for the Jupiter landing could not be made until they knew what the situation was going to be. For it would be one thing if the station were located on the giant planet itself, another if on one of its satellites. The colonel wasted no time. "While you were on Mars and we were waiting for you, I took the opportunity to examine the outer shell of this ship. You know, of course, that we are constantly being bombarded by cosmic dust, the micrometeorites that always prove troublesome to Earth satellites and space platforms. The ship has been fortunate in that it has not been struck by any meteoric matter of size, but we have been peppered heavily by dust particles. As a result, the outer shell of our ship is pitted in some spots, and in several places worn perhaps dangerously thin. I don't mean to imply that there are going to be any holes very soon, but I think that there are some parts which we should reinforce or patch." When he stopped for breath, Burl broke in. "You mean you want us to work on the outer shell?" Lockhart nodded. "Somebody has to do it, and during flights you men are the deck crew. So it's going to be your baby. I am going to keep the ship on free fall for the next several periods, and this should make it simpler for you to go outside in spacesuits and do the job." The next hour saw all three hard at work, dressed in heavy, sealed, warmed outer space outfits, wearing metal bowl-like helmets with sealed glass fronts, and drawing oxygen from tanks strapped on their backs. The three men left the inner sphere and emerged on the outer surface of the Magellan. Burl found it a weird and awesome experience. There was no gravitational drag, so that even as he stepped through the exit port, the scene shifted until he seemed to be standing on metal ground, looking upward at thousands and tens of thousands of silent white stars. Nothing moved, except, of course, the spacesuited bodies of the two men already half out of sight, looking not quite human. There was no sound save that of his own breath and the faint hum of the radiophone tucked in his helmet. He was firmly attached to the ship by a long nylon rope, which he hooked to rings set on the outer shell. He made his way toward the wide, rounded nose of the ship. In one hand he carried a bucket of liquid plastic, resembling tar in thickness and consistency. With a brush in the other hand he would stop, held to the surface by magnetic soles, and smear the plastic protective surfacing over the little pits and pocket marks that now marred the surface of the once spotless ship. The work was not hard, and shortly became a routine which he found did not require much concentration. It was dip and smear in a steady rhythmic motion. Haines was working out of sight on a more complex repair job which involved welding a sheet of metal over a badly beaten and sprung section. Ferrati was on the opposite side of the ship. As he worked, Burl watched the stars, and every now and then was rewarded by the sight of a moving spark of light, an asteroid or meteor. He could see mighty Jupiter ahead, a wide disk of white and yellow, faintly belted with gray and pale blue bands. The famous red spot was not visible. 4 of the planet's 12 attendant satellites strung out alongside it, and he recognized them as the big ones discovered by Galileo with his first telescope: Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. The other 8 were tiny and probably would not be visible until they were right on top of Jupiter, though he supposed that Russell Clyde could probably pick them out now by telescopic sightings. Burl could hear in his radio the sound of someone whistling softly, and supposed it was Ferrati. There was a short cut-in as Lockhart called a time shift on the general intercom. A brief exchange followed between Caton in the Zeta Ring chamber of the ship's nose and the colonel, with the information that Caton was coming down into the living section. Then, after a brief period of silence, Burl heard a series of odd noises on his phones. Something went bump, and the sound faded. He was now on the nose of the ship itself, the wide mushrooming surface beneath his feet, and Jupiter high over his head. Bending over, about to smear a dab of plastic on a tiny pitted mark, he suddenly felt himself gripped and pulled. Caught by surprise, he jerked upward, the brush flying from his hand and sailing into the sky. His shoes clung momentarily to the surface, but their magnetic grip was too weak, and they loosened. He kicked out wildly, falling away into the emptiness of outer space, a space which had a moment ago been a sky and had suddenly turned into a bottomless pit. He fell backward, seized momentarily by terror. He was brought up short by his rope. It held, and he grabbed it and hung on. Something had changed. Somebody had altered the ship's drive. The ship was no longer on free fall. It was on gravity drive, going backward, not driving toward Jupiter under added acceleration, but fighting to reduce its fall, to stop its drive, to fly away from Jupiter. In his earphones there was a jumble of sounds. He heard Ferrati yelling and realized that he, too, must be falling away from the ship, saved only by a rope. And the voice of Haines, plastered flat against the surface, the ship driving upward against him. Vague noises emanated from the control room. Evidently, no one was at the commander's mic. He called into it, adding his voice to those of his comrades. After several agonizing minutes, a voice came over the radio. It was Russell Clyde's, and it was excited and angry. "Hold on out there as long as you can. Lockhart's been knocked unconscious. We're trying to get into the engine room and take back control." Perplexed, Burl shouted, "Who's in the engine room? Take control from whom?" There was another pause as he heard the sounds of pounding, as if someone were trying to hammer open a metal panel. Then Russ's voice came on again. "It's Bolton. He came to suddenly and sneaked up here, knocked out the commander, and climbed up into the Zeta Ring chamber. Caton was down below, and Bolton's locked the trap door and is running the drive. He's reversed our route away from Jupiter and into outer space. Bolton's apparently gone crazy, and we can't get in to stop him." Burl, suspended over an abyss, clung to the end of the taut, thin nylon line as the ship pulled him helplessly along into the uncharted depths of infinity, with a madman at the controls. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13. The Pole of Callisto. Burl surveyed his position. Judging from the apparent weight of his body, Bolton was decelerating the ship at a little less than 1 gravity. The nylon cord was hooked into a bolt near the center of the ship. It would be possible for Burl to climb up it and reach a firmer grip on the outside shell. There was no time to be lost. An increase in the ship's speed might increase his weight several times over. He began to climb back, reeling in the rope, pulling himself up hand over hand, just as he had done many times in the gymnasium of his high school back home. Halfway up, Clyde's voice came on his helmet phones. "Will all members of the crew report their present positions to me? Haines?" He called each man's name, beginning with the 3 outside. Haines and Ferrati were clinging to the surface on the far, now forward, end of the ship. The rest of the crew was somewhere in the living sphere. Lockhart was still unconscious. Burl could hear the faint sounds of a discussion in the control room, and also thumps as Caton and Shea continued to try to break open the entry to the generator chambers. Then Russ spoke again. "Burl, it looks as if you're elected. You seem to be the only one in the right place. There's a hatchway into the nose of the ship. From the outside, it's just below the central circle. Can you see it? How close are you to it?" Burl was almost at the surface now. The circular inset ring that marked the hatchway entry port was a few feet from where his rope was hooked. He described it to Russ. "Can you reach it without losing your grip? If you can, do you think you can open it?" came the radio voice quickly. Burl reached the surface and grasped the hook. He studied the circular panel carefully. "I can reach it all right. There's a holder hook alongside it. But what will I do when I get there?" "Open it," Russ ordered brusquely. "It unscrews from either side. There's a short lock space between the outer shell and the inner shielding of the generator chamber. Get inside and seal the door after you. From there you can work your way into the emergency nose door to the engines. Keep your suit on. While the generators are shielded, there's no telling what Bolton may have done. The suit will give you some protection. After you go through the door, it's up to you. Bolton will be there. You'll have to stop him somehow. Caton says if you can find the toolkit, you may be able to get a wrench to use as a weapon. If you can get through without his seeing you and open the trap door to us, we'll do the rest. But it depends on you." Burl bit his lip. "Okay, here I go." There was no question or argument. Everyone's life was at stake, and he happened to be in the strategic position. He swung over to the panel, hooked his foot under the hand grip, and grasped the lever inset in the surface. He twisted it. After a brief moment of resistance, the panel turned slowly. There was a sudden puff as the air within escaped, and then the hatchway stood open. Burl climbed inside. He caught at the open plug, pulled it back, and screwed it tightly from the inside. Now he was in a dark, narrow space. He could feel the flow of air automatically being pumped back in, and heard the humming of the generators through his suit. Working his way along the inner wall in darkness, he finally felt the edge of the metal door that opened into the Zeta Ring chamber itself. He leaned against it, listening, but there was no sound. He turned the handle and threw his shoulder against the door. It gave, then swung open. He stepped cautiously into the engine room. It was large and circular, fitting neatly within the nose of the ship. The wide tubes of the AG generator ring ran around the outside. The reactors were heavy blocks of ceiling-high metal, shielded and showing only the dials that registered their output. Other machines, the rod storage units and the condensers, were all carefully hidden behind clean metal shielding. The panel that controlled the engines was unattended in the center of the room. Standing by one of the shielded reactors was Bolton, his back to Burl. He was hammering at the reactor with a bar, evidently trying to tear away the shielding to get at the guts. Stealthily, the boy made his way to the locker where the tools were kept. Just as he opened it, his hand slipped. The door of the locker clanged against the wall. The burly Marine captain whirled, saw Burl, and gave a yell of rage. Burl grabbed a wrench and swung it threateningly. Bolton drew back. His face was pale, with an odd expression on it, as if he did not recognize Burl or understand what Burl said. Burl tried to reason with him, but the glaring eyes were those of a total stranger, or, as it seemed then, an alien beast. Bolton cried in anger, dropped his bar, and charged Burl with his hands outstretched. Burl swung the wrench, but the strength of the older man tore it from his grasp, hurling it away. The boy tried to dodge, and then the two bodies collided. The instant the two men touched, there was a violent flash of light. Burl felt a shock that left him stunned and reeling. Bolton collapsed in a heap on the floor. Burl steadied himself, keeping a wary eye on the captain. Bolton sat up slowly, putting a hand to his head. "Boy, that was some kickback," he muttered. He looked at Burl. Give me a hand up. We've got to get back to the Jeep and scram out of here fast. The A-bomb's already set." Burl was startled. He realized in a moment, though, that Bolton recalled nothing of the past few days. His last memory seemed to be of the blast in the Martian basement. But now the captain was apparently himself again. Bolton got shakily to his feet. He seemed confused. "How'd I get here, son?" he asked in surprise. Burl gave a sigh of relief. "I guess you're all right now, but let's get the trap door to the control room open. Clyde and Caton have got to get the ship back on course. There'll be time to explain afterward." Half an hour later, when Lockhart had recovered and resumed command, the ship was restored to its proper course. Russ filled Bolton in on what had happened and ventured a guess as to why. "You must have been given some sort of charge by that globe in the Mars Sun Tap Station," Russ said. "It turned you into a sort of robot, a human body running on a charge of alien energy that responded to commands of the Sun Tap outfit. Apparently, it took a long time before the charge had complete control of your body. Obviously, it then could act only in some general way, telling you to wreck the ship. Now, Burl, your body received a charge a long time ago. Whatever its nature, it counteracted or shorted Bolton's when you came into contact." Both Bolton and Burl thought that made sense. "But," Burl conjectured, "isn't it possible that the charge in my own body has also been shorted?" Russ shrugged. "Maybe. We'll find out at the next stop. And, incidentally, that's not going to be on Jupiter itself, but on its moon, Callisto. We've traced the line of distortions." "That's good news," said Burl. "I had the feeling you were worried about Jupiter. The planet's so huge it would have meant real trouble trying to land. The books say its atmosphere is thick, unbreathable, and moves in gale velocity around it." Russ nodded. "With Jupiter almost 89,000 miles in diameter, it would have been a tough problem to maneuver outside this ship. In fact, impossible, not to mention the fact that the atmosphere, mostly ammonia and other frigid gases, moves in several independent belts. However, Callisto should be okay." "That's something we know about our opponents anyway," said Burl. "They must have physical limitations enough like ours to rule out places where we couldn't move either." Bolton showed no further effects of his experience. In time, the Magellan drew near Jupiter. Callisto, its fifth satellite outward, moved about the mighty planet at a distance of 1,170,000 miles. It was a large satellite as they go, 3,220 miles in diameter, larger, in fact, than Mercury, but, as Russ explained, it was a queer place in its own fashion. For despite its size, Callisto was apparently not a solid body as we think of it. Its density totaled only a little more than that of water, its mass half that of the Earth's moon, a notoriously porous body. They bore down on Callisto, matching their speed to its, and swung close to its surface. It had almost no atmosphere, just a thin layer of the heavier gases. It was a belted world, without clearly defined continents or surface markings. Its equatorial zone was one vast, featureless belt of darkish gray. Its temperate zones were white, with patches of yellow here and there. But its poles were gray again. "The satellite's like a huge ball of thin mud that's never hardened," said Burl, as they studied the strange terrain. "The equator's the softest. It seems to be a river of muddy water, hundreds of miles wide. Only it can't be water. Probably semi-solidified gases, holding dust and grains of matter in suspension," said Russ. "The temperate zones are the same stuff, only colder and therefore more stable. A thin crust of frozen gases over a planet-wide ocean of semi-liquid substance." "The Sun Tap Station's on the southern pole," said Burl. "That must be solid." It was. The poles of Callisto were actually two continent-sized islands of shell. Dry, mud-like stuff, hard as rock, floating on the endless seas of the semi-liquid planet. The station, a ring set up quite like the one on Earth, stood in the geographic center of the South Pole. The Magellan hovered over it, while a landing party went down in the four-man rocket plane. Clyde, Haines, and Burl were the landing party. This time only Burl entered the station after a hole had been blasted in the outer shell. While the red-headed astronomer took samples and made observations, Haines kept watch. Nobody knew what type of defense awaited them here. Burl found the controls easily enough. He was afraid that he might have lost his physical charge, but it was not so. The controls functioned. The sun-tap station died. The effect was not very noticeable, for Callisto was already far from the sun, and the thin atmosphere could not diminish the dark sky of outer space. What the great masts caught must have been only the relay from other stations, or perhaps the invisible rays of the distant sun. Burl saw no reason to linger, and the three of them gathered up their equipment. As they started back toward the rocket plane, they heard an ominous rumble in the ground. A sudden spurt of blazing gas shot up from the center of the station. "Duck!" yelled Haines, and they fell flat on the ground. Burl held his hands protectively over his head as an explosion shook the building. There was no rain of rocks. Whatever the blast, Callisto's gravity was too weak to attract the debris that flew high above the station. "It was an atomic explosion," Haines shouted into his helmet mic. "They mined the station. Run for it." They raced for the rocket plane. As they ran, Burl felt the ground quiver beneath him, and huge cracks began to spread, rippling through the hard ground. They reached the plane and piled in. Rust took off just as the surface cracked open in 1,000 places, like an ice sheet breaking in an Arctic thaw. As they rocketed back to the Magellan, the whole polar cap, an area hundreds of miles around the sun-tap station, split apart. Great spurts of liquid magma, the liquid gas dust from the heart of the planet, shot up like fountains. Parts of the shell-like polar continent were disappearing beneath this new ocean. Their little atomic bomb shattered the thin crust. "The whole polar island will probably sink," said Russ. "It was a clever trap. They knew what would happen." "Saturn's next," said Burl. "What will they have set up for us there?" They reached the Magellan, loaded the rocket plane aboard, and pulled out, setting their course for the ringed planet. But even as they did so, something was coming from Saturn to meet them. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. Rockets Away. The next lap of their journey was uneventful. Saturn, the next outward planet from the sun and the second largest, would present the same problem as Jupiter. This world, famous for its mysterious rings, was about 71,000 miles in diameter and had a large family of satellites, 9 in all. The sun-tap station would be on one of these, Burl thought. Saturn was almost as far out from Jupiter as Jupiter itself had been from the sun. This meant that the trip would be as long for the Magellan as the distance they had already traveled to get to Jupiter. Fortunately, the AG drive was a remarkable thing. It was possible to accelerate to fantastic speeds, in theory, probably right up to the speed of light, and so, where great distances were concerned, the ship simply rushed its fall through on Saturn's line of gravitation. Bolton had fully recovered and showed no lingering signs of the strange electronic charge. Because of the limited size of the crew, Lockhart put the Marine captain back on full duty. He would participate in future landings as if nothing had ever happened. At the same time, Lockhart cautioned Haines, Burl, and Ferrati to keep their eyes on him. It was always possible that the foe's weapon had made some more lasting mark. Haines had his group make a new inventory of their weapons. Burl, working with them in his spacesuit in the partially protected region of the cargo hull, was surprised at the variety. There was a second rocket plane, a two-man outfit. In addition, they had a large store of offensive weapons, including a small but formidable supply of atomic explosives. Haines gave Burl and Ferrati, who were new to military weapons, brief introductory lectures on their use. Burl saw just what a hand-sized tactical atomic shell looked like and how it worked. He learned how to operate the heavy caliber rocket gun which hurled this tiniest of atomic bombs. And so the time passed, and the amazing disk of Saturn began to grow in their viewplates. It was banded, much like Jupiter, and its brilliant rings surrounded it with a mystic halo that set it apart from all the other worlds of the sun's family. Burl was watching Saturn through the largest of the nose viewplates when he thought that he saw a black dot crossing its face. He had located the known moons of Saturn, and this was not one of them. Excited, he called Russell Clyde. Could it be a 10th satellite, he asked, pointing out the tiny dot. Russ squinted his eyes, then, calculating mentally, he shook his head. I don't think so. It looks to me more like something that's in space between us and Saturn. In fact, it must be fairly close to us for us to see it at all. He turned to Lockhart, who was at the control panel with Oberfield. You'd better have a look. Could be a giant meteor coming in our direction. We're moving mighty fast, commented Oberfield. It should have passed us already if it were a meteor. Instead, it seems to be maintaining the same distance, neither growing larger nor smaller. Acts very odd for a natural body. Uh-huh, said Lockhart. This calls for caution. He quickly went back to the controls, pressed the general alarm button, then called into the intercom, all hands to emergency stations. Haines and party, please prepare defensive positions. This means me, gulped Burl, as he scooted down the central hatch, almost colliding with Caton and Shea on their way to the engine room. He met Haines, and with neat dispatch, all four slipped into spacesuits. Then out through the cargo hold to posts by escape hatches. Burl and Haines, at the main entry point, unlimbered the long rocket launcher that had been set up in the passageway. Haines placed 3 shells of differing strength in position. They heard through their helmet phones that the mysterious dot was drawing closer. Haines set up one of the launching racks, which was equipped with a telescopic sighter, and peered through the eyepiece. Apparently he caught it, for he grunted, then motioned to Burl to take a look. It was no natural object. It had the shape of a dumbbell, 2 spheres joined together by a short middle bar. One sphere was a deep golden color, the other a bluish silver, the connecting rod a coppery metal. The pattern of spears certainly suggests the sun tappers to me, said Burl. Haines murmured his agreement. Lockhart's voice came on the phone. We've decided it's one of the sun tapper ships. We're not going to wait to make sure. Before we left Earth, I can inform you now, I received a directive from the President to regard the builders of these sun tap stations as active enemies. My orders are that we are not to attempt to undertake peaceful contact, but are to treat them on sight as armed foes in the field. To do otherwise is to risk Earth's last active defense, this ship. I don't think I have to argue this further, considering our recent experiences. His voice hesitated, then rang out firmly, Haines, you can commence firing at will. Haines clicked his tongue and reached for one of the shells. Okay, Burl, aim at her direct. This one's got a proximity nose that'll beam at her and drive itself wherever she ducks. He slid the rocket shell into the launcher. Burl sighted, and then Haines pressed the trigger. There was a whoosh of fire and a flare from the launcher's nose. A minute spark winged into the darkness toward the spot, still many miles away, where the strange ship hung. They watched with bated breath. Suddenly there was a flash of light from the other ship, a vivid lightning bolt which leaped out and flared up briefly in space. Then darkness again. They fired a burst of energy at us. It hit the rocket shell instead, said Haines. Well, now we know. They used bolts of pure energy, something like the one they fired at Bolton. He fitted another shell into the launcher and fired again. Again a spark winged its way, and the bolt of energy burst out to detonate the shell. Burl whistled. How did they spot it so fast? He asked. I don't think they did. They're firing at us. The rocket shell only happened to be between, snapped Haines. Ferretti, he called into his mic. Fire a shrapnel shell at them when I say the word. Advise me when ready. Ferretti's voice snapped back. Right you are, sir. Here it is now. 1 minute. Okay. On target. While Ferretti and Bolton were readying their shot from the lower cargo port near the tail of the ship, Haines and Burl had been fitting the largest of their shells into their own launcher. They aimed it carefully at the frontmost sphere of the enemy. Ferretti, fire, cried Haines, and then slowly counted to 5 and pressed the stud of his own launcher. There was a momentary flicker as Ferretti's rocket shell raced forth below. Then, after a definite time lapse, the exhaust of Haines's heavy shell appeared. The shrapnel shell is segmented and doesn't have a proximity guide, Haines explained. As soon as it's on its way, the nose comes apart into a dozen small shells, each with a standard explosive charge. The shell we used has an atomic bomb warhead and is on proximity guide. It'll chase that ship to the ends of the system if they don't blast it first. He paused. There was another bolt of raw energy from the dumbbell-shaped craft, and this time a series of flares in the space between. The shrapnel charges had been touched off. Burl held his breath. I figure it takes them a while to recharge their guns, said Haines. Our own blockbuster should get there before they fire again. Then suddenly there came a sharper flare of brilliant light. For an instant Burl was blinded by the glare. When he recovered, he peered avidly through the telescopic sighter. He saw the ship, but where there had been a golden sphere, there was now only a shattered fragment of twisted metal. The enemy ship changed before his eyes. The remaining silvery sphere glowed brighter and took on a golden hue. Then it seemed as if the ship were growing smaller. He realized finally that it was retreating. He gave an involuntary shout, and in his earphones he heard the same shouts of triumph from every voice on the ship. Although it might have been possible to pursue the battered enemy ship, the Magellan did not try. They were still on course for Saturn, and were not going to deviate. They reached Saturn after several more days. Matching their great speed with that of the ringed world in its orbit took time, and then they began their survey. As they had suspected, the Sun-Tap station was on one of the moons. The moon was called Iapetus, the third largest of Saturn's family. It was about 800 miles in diameter, and the next to the farthest satellite from Saturn. Russ was disappointed that they hadn't picked Titan, the biggest moon of all. Titan was over 2,000 miles wide and appeared to have an atmosphere of methane. The view of Saturn was awesome, even from Iapetus's orbit 2 million miles away. Burl knew it would be a sight unparalleled in the system. The great broad rings, composed of innumerable tiny particles of metal, stone, and possibly ice, encircled it as if held there by an invisible hand. They were, he knew, the particles of a moon that had either come too close to Saturn's great gravitational pull to hold its shape, or else had never escaped far enough to congeal as one solid mass. Iapetus was a solid world, though. A rocky body, it had a dull gleam and was streaked here and there with layers of white and yellow, where veins of frozen gases lay forever upon the frigid surface. No atmosphere veiled the surface nor softened the harsh, jagged mountains and clefts of this forbidding little sub-planet. The Sun Tap station stood in plain sight on a high plateau near a polar region. The Magellan hovered over it while Lockhart held a council of war. "I don't see what's to be gained by attempting a landing party," he said. "We've taken all the readings and pictures of the other stations, and we've had a couple of narrow escapes. They've probably mined this one, and they have had plenty of time to prepare a trap. I'm in favor of simply dropping an H-bomb on it and leaving." After a brief discussion, with only perfunctory objections from Clyde and Oberfield, who, as astronomers, wanted to land to take other readings, the decision was carried. The Magellan swung up a couple hundred of miles above the Sun Tapper's plateau. Haines and his crew loaded the bulky H-bomb into the main launcher in the tail of the ship. Then the Magellan aimed itself at the target, and the rocket-driven bomb roared out. Down it sped, zeroing in on the wall of the station. There was a blinding flash, a glare as brilliant as that of the sun itself, as it hit square on the mark. This time Burl watched through carefully shielded view screens. The scene was obscured by a wide-flung cloud of white, tens of thousands of cubic feet of satellite rock turned instantaneously into dust particles. After the dust cleared away, they saw only a gaping crater where the plateau had been, a volcanic hole, miles wide and glowing red, from which spread vast, deep cracks throughout the entire visible hemisphere of the moon. The men on the Magellan were awed and silent. The thought occurred to each of them, beyond his capacity to deny it, what if this had happened on Earth? "Of course," said Ferrati slowly, "the low gravity of Iapetus accounts for the greater extent of the disaster. If this had been Bikini or—" But under the glares of the rest of the crew, his sentence trailed off weakly. Lockhart turned away from the viewer. "Mr. Oberfield," he said, unexpectedly formal and official, "you may chart our course for Uranus." "Aye, aye, sir," said that usually dour personage with alacrity. With forced smiles, the rest of the crew drifted away to their duties. The Magellan pulled away from Saturn, heading out again toward the limits of the solar system. But it was several days before everyone had quite managed to dismiss the vision of the H-bomb from his mind. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. Ice Cold on Oberon. Nevertheless, from that point on, a different spirit seemed to animate everyone aboard the Magellan. There was the feeling that they had closed with the enemy and found themselves not wanting. There was the feeling that they possessed powers not inferior to those of their unknown enemies. The thought had been haunting them all along that they were in the position of a backward people facing an advanced invader, something like the problem of the Aztecs when faced with the gunpowder and armor of the conquistadors. Now they knew that though the Sun Tapper's weapons were different, and indeed advanced beyond earthly technology, they themselves were not without resources equally deadly to the foe. After the memory of the H-bomb's power had finally been absorbed, the crew's activities began to indicate that the ship was coming into the crucial phase of its journey. Haines and Bolton were going over the list of military supplies with sharp, calculating eyes and slight grins at the thought of retribution to come. Ferrati was overhauling the rocket planes and land-traveling devices, making them ship-shape. Russell, Clyde, and Burl surveyed the sky, anxious to be the first to spot what they hoped would be the limping body of the battered and fleeing dumbbell ship, a little a-tingle at the hope of spotting another such ship, feeling now almost like the hunting dog that has finally spotted the fox. Lockhart himself reflected this mood of growing excitement. He prowled the ship, examining the mighty purring engines, querying Caton, Shea, and Detmar as to how it could better its performance, how fast it could be made to shift speed and directions. He studied the orbits and locations of the remaining planets. Uranus, is not too far off our path to Pluto," he announced one day. "We'll make it in time to wipe out their plant there. But Neptune, whose orbit is between those of Uranus and Pluto, is away off our track, a third of the way around the sun. We're going to skip it, hit directly for Pluto and their main base, the end of their line. I don't want to give them too much time to make repairs or to get any reinforcements. I think they're limited in numbers, and we ought to slam them while they still are." There was no dissent at this. As the days rolled past, the men of the Magellan began to chafe in their repressed desire to finish the matter. At last Uranus came into sight, a large globe, very much like Saturn and Jupiter in that it was of low density and great dimensions. Roughly 64 times the size of Earth, its density was barely above that of water, and it probably had no solid surface to speak of. An inhospitable mass of unbreathable gases at temperatures fantastically lower than the freezing point of water. As they drew close to the planet, they could see that it was also banded, pale green bands alternating with lighter ones, indicating that some sections of its atmospheric belt moved faster than others. It had 5 moons, which rotated in opposite direction from those of any other satellite system. It was on the farthest moon, Oberon, a sphere 600 miles in diameter, that the sun-tap station revealed itself. They swung down to observe it and to place their bomb. Not an H-bomb, though. They recognized that they had erred in thinking they needed such a powerful explosive. Oberon was without an atmosphere, a rocky world with streaks of frozen gases and here and there the sheen of a lake of ice. Ice that would never melt, that on this world would be permanent, hard as metal material. There was, none the less, something about the surface that seemed to bother Russ. "Do you notice what seems to be a sort of shifting movement?" he asked Burl. Burl looked, and sure enough, he saw that in places there seemed a flickering of lights. "Yes," he said, "I see it. What do you suppose it is?" "I don't know," said Russ, "but I'm going to ask Lockhart to put the ship down and let me take a look." Lockhart at first demurred, but finally decided that they could afford the brief halt. The Magellan approached the surface, safely distant from the sun-tap station. Burl and Russ descended in the 2-man rocket plane, while the teardrop-shaped ship hung half a mile above them. They landed on a narrow plain, bordered by low ridges of mountains shining with streaks of frozen hydrogen. A layer of cosmic dust hung over the rocks. Wearing insulated space suits, they left the rocket plane. It was Burl who made the first discovery. He pointed dramatically at the ground. "Look, Russ, the dust is full of streaks and marks. It hasn't been lying here undisturbed. Something has crossed over it." Russ kneeled in order to look more carefully. The layer of dust, the consequences of an airless world exposed without protection to the endless fall of cosmic particles, was indeed not the level, undisturbed surface it should have been. Here and there were light, low depressions, as if something had moved across it, like a small snake crawling on its belly. In one place lay a series of depressions, like the footprints of some light-bodied creature. "Impossible," muttered Russ. "Life can't exist here." But they trudged on, across the barren flat to a ridge of rock. Here they found what they thought to be impossible. Clustered along the side of the ridge, in the faint light of the distant and tiny sun, was a series of thin blue stalks about half a foot in height. On each stalk was a flat scalloped top like a little umbrella. It was sometimes bright blue and sometimes violet. As they drew nearer, these little stalks began to sway and turn their tops toward them. "They look like plants," said Burl. "Plants made of something glassy and plastic." As Russ studied the strange growths, something moved across the dusty tract behind them. It was long and thin and wiggly, with a ridge of tiny crystalline hairs along its back. It was like a snake, perhaps, but one made of some unbelievably delicate glasswork. It slid among the plants and wrapped itself around one. The growth snapped suddenly and then was absorbed by the creature. Russ shook his head in amazement. "This is a great discovery," he said incredulously. "This is life. It's life of a chemical type utterly different from the protoplasm of Earth and Mars and Venus. It's life designed to exist among liquid gases and frozen air, life which can't have anything in common with protoplasm. Apparently, it couldn't exist even on Saturn's moons. They were too hot for it." Russ was carried away with the possibilities. "This hints at great things, Burl. Out near Pluto, where the system is even colder, there may be other forms of this frigid plasmic life. If I may coin a word, this means a whole new science." They returned to the ship with their astonishing news. The Magellan slowly skimmed over the surface of Oberon. They found whole forests of this glassy, frigid vegetation, but not much evidence of any animal life larger than the creature the two explorers had seen. Over the Sun Tap station, a ringed layout like the others, whose clusters of masts caught the emanations of the distant sun on the one hand and directed them outward to the still unseen planet Pluto on the other, the ship halted. It drew up 50 miles, pointed its tail, and blasted forth a rocket-driven tactical atomic bomb. The blast on Oberon was tiny compared to the one which had devastated Iapetus, but it still left a deep indentation in the surface for future space flyers to see. They left it and the Uranian orbit behind them and headed outward once again. Behind them now lay the worlds of the sun's family, while far off to the one side lay the tiny light of Neptune. Ahead, between them and the vast gulf of interstellar space, lay only the dark, mysterious ninth planet, the enigmatic world named after the lord of the underworld, Pluto. The Magellan plunged on, in constant acceleration, moving outward to the farthest limit of the solar system. They had traveled almost 1,800,000,000 miles from the sun, and yet they still had 2,000,000,000 miles more to go. This was the longest stretch, and during it they would reach speeds greater than any they had touched before. They shot outward faster and faster, eating up the infinite emptiness of space, driving the vast stretch that divided Pluto from its neighbors. The sun, already small, dwindled steadily. It was still the brightest star in their sky of all the stars. It alone retained a disc-like shape, and the faint flicker of its coronal flames could occasionally be made out. But it no longer dominated the heavens. To find the sun, they now had to look for it as they would for any other star. As for Earth, it could not be seen. So close to the tiny sun it lay that only their sharpest telescopes could bring it out. Even Jupiter showed up only as a thin, tiny crescent near the solar point of light. "Pluto's a mysterious world," said Burl, as he and Russ scanned the heavens for the first glimpse of it. "The accounts in your astronomy books give very little information on it, but what they give is strange. They say it's the only planet beyond Mars that is a small solid world like the inner ones. It seems to be the same size as Earth, not at all like the big outer worlds. And they say it seems to be the same mass as Earth, a solid world whose surface gravity would be the same as our own planet's." Russ nodded. "It's an odd one, all right. There's now even some belief that it's not a true planet, but one that was once a satellite of Neptune. Its orbit is peculiar. It apparently may cut into that of Neptune. In fact, everything hints at Pluto not being a true child of our sun. It may be a world captured from afar, a lonely wanderer cast off from some other star, captured by the sun after millions of years of drifting lightless through space." Beyond them, in their vision, lay only the stars of outer space, the void that did not belong to our system. And then, finally, they found Pluto, a tiny point of light shining among the blazing stars. They saw the disk, dimly reflected in the light of the faraway sun. Even as they were taking their first long look at the dark planet, the general alarm rang. They had caught up with the fleeing wreck of the Sun Tapper's scout cruiser. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16. In orbit around Pluto. There was a mad rush to action stations. Detmar, Ferrati, and Oberfield, who had been in their bunks, dashed to their posts, while others tried to pass them in both directions. Haines and Burl hastily climbed into their spacesuits, while Ferrati and Bolton manned the inner defensive controls. Burl pulled the tight-fitting harness of his insulated spacesuit over him. The shape of the Sun Tapper ship came into focus on the tiny screen of the airlock viewer. It was approaching them at a frighteningly rapid pace. He could see the broken framework of one of its two globes, the one on which they had scored their hit. The other globe and the connecting passages were strikingly clear. Tiny circles of windows were visible in the passage section, which undoubtedly housed the operators of the vessel. For a fleeting instant he realized that as yet none of the Earthlings had any inkling of what these creatures looked like. While he knew that the scene was telescopic, the ship was undoubtedly approaching them fast, or rather, they were catching up to it at a perilous pace. Whether the wrecked enemy had slowed down more than they had as it approached its Plutonian base, or whether some other surprise lay ahead, they had no idea. Burl felt the jarring impact as Lockhart cut the Magellan's drive. There was an instant of weightlessness, and then their weight reversed as the AG drive strove to slow down the ship. Within the airlock, they were outside the living space of the sphere, suspended beneath the drive chamber. Burl could see the walls of the inner sphere whirl past him a foot away as the living quarters rotated to shift with the gravitational change. And at that very moment, while all those inside were temporarily helpless, disaster struck. Burl had just finished adjusting his airtight helmet, and Haines was already on his way forward to the outer shell port and the rocket guns when there was a flash of lightning from the crippled enemy spaceship. The foe was still capable of fighting, and it had fired first, alarmingly close. Within what seemed a split second after Burl's eyes had registered the flash on the little viewplate, the Magellan received the full force of the mighty electronic discharge. To Burl it seemed as if a thunderclap had sounded in his ears, and as if he had been plunged into a bath of white flames. The walls of the passage sparkled brilliantly, blinding light filled the air, and Burl's body vibrated as it would to an electric shock. He reeled wildly, catching at the walls and almost falling. In a few seconds his senses recovered, although his body was still humming from the blow and his ears were ringing. The viewplate had gone black. The lights in the airlock corridor were dark, and when he tried to gain his feet he realized that the ship now had no gravity. It was falling free without power. Haines was slumped in the end of the corridor, with the port nearly opened. Burl pushed his way over to him and helped the groggy explorer to his feet. There was no sound, and Burl suddenly remembered that he hadn't taken time to switch on his helmet phone. He did so, and was relieved to hear Haines's voice asking if he was all right. "I'm okay," Burl called. "Let's get this port open. Maybe we can hit back at least once." Together, they turned the bolts and pushed the thick outer shell door open. Without the aid of telescopic sights, they could see the shape of the Sun Tapper vessel quite plainly, outlined against a curtain of distant stars. Struggling not to think what might be going on within the Magellan, their earphones registered nothing except each other. They unlimbered the long tube of the rocket launcher and aimed point blank at the foe. Haines reached into the ammunition locker vault alongside the passageway and selected the biggest and wickedest of the available shells. He twisted the dial in the warhead, and, while Burl held the aim, shoved in the rocket shell. With a press of the button, the missile roared out of the tube, racing in an arc of fire directly toward the faint vision of the other ship. They watched with bated breath, counting the seconds, hoping not to see another blast of electrical fire. But apparently the foe had exhausted its limited resources, for the thin, spidery line of rocket sparks reached out farther and farther until it seemed to touch the surface of the golden globe. There was a great flare in the sky now, an outpouring of fire and hot metal. When it cleared away, the sky was empty. Haines wearily drew the outer port shut. "Now let's see if we're goners, too," he said quietly. They sealed the outer shell and made their way along the dark passage. Even as they were unlocking the toggles of the inner hatch, the corridor lights started to flicker. They would light up dimly and then flicker out, light up again, flare for an instant, and then die down. Someone was alive within the ship. They got the hatch open. In the central section of the living sphere, the lights were also dim, and in a few places they were completely out. They emerged and closed the hatch behind them. Only after Haines had tested the inner atmosphere and found it still pressurized did they open their helmets and climb stiffly out of the spacesuits, wincing at the bruises they had sustained but had not noticed until then. The air pressure was all right, but there was a smell of burned rubber and insulation in the air. Now that their helmets were off, they could hear voices somewhere above. They found Oberfield lying unconscious, thrown to the floor by the sudden shift of the ship. They climbed into the control room. Lockhart was floating in the air near the open hatchway leading to the engine room overhead. He was calling out orders to someone who was within. Russ was working over the navigation desk, a bandage around his head, trying to figure out where they would be, where they were heading, without having access to the still dark viewplates. Lockhart twisted in the weightless air when he saw them. He seemed both relieved and distressed. "I'm glad you're okay, but I had hoped you'd be able to put in a blow for us." Burl realized that inside the ship they had no way of knowing that vengeance had been served. Hastily he explained. His words cheered everyone. Russ and Lockhart shouted joyously. Detmar poked his head down the hatch and called the news back to his two fellows who were struggling to get the AG generators functioning. The bolt of energy, whatever it may have been designed to do to a ship of the Sun-Tapper build, did not have the totally disastrous effect on the Magellan that it was intended to have. It had knocked out their electrical system temporarily, burned out some of its parts, and caused the AG system to fail, although the atomic piles were impervious to such currents. Oberfield, Ferrati, and Shea were badly hurt. There now followed an anxious period, during which more and more of the electrical system began to function as the men labored to rig up emergency wires, to replace burned-out bulbs and lines. There was a general cheer when the viewplates flickered into life again, though not all functioned. They again had access to the sky about them, even though not all sectors were covered. The humming in the engine room started up, rose and fell uneasily a couple of times, and then they felt a surge of force. Lockhart fell gently to the floor as the ship began to drive ahead, and then in a few minutes the AG drive was back on and the Magellan was again under control. "We took what they had to give, and it wasn't enough," exulted Haines. "Now wait till we reach their main works. We'll show them." Lockhart shook his head wearily as he and Russ worked over the controls. "Let's hope we don't have to show them soon. Our ship is running on emergency rigging. Caton says he's going to have to rest the ship and rewire a good part of the system. Meanwhile, we will be able to reach Pluto safely enough." Pluto was visible in the forward viewplates. They could see lighter and darker patches on it, almost like the markings of continents and oceans, but there was no evidence of an atmosphere, nor had they expected any. Readings showed that the average surface temperature was about 200 degrees Fahrenheit below zero, even lower in many places. They searched the surface for signs of their foe. They found what they wanted on the North Polar Depression, a basin in the oblate sphere of Pluto. There was no ring station. There rose a vast pile of dark masonry, a mighty structure covering at least a square mile, a fortress building whose roofs bristled with an array of masts and reflectors. And hanging on patrol over this polar basin were two more of the dumbbell ships. "We're in no position to come to grips with them," said Lockhart. "I'm going to take the Magellan into a low orbit around Pluto's equator. We'll be out of their sight, yet near enough to do some probing and exploring while we're making repairs." This they proceeded to do, swinging the ship down to within a few hundred miles of the Plutonian surface, settling on a fixed orbit around the equator exactly as the Sputniks of years past had first circled the bulk of the earth. Staying far enough up to maintain orbit, they were close enough to be below the planet's radiation belt. Taking stock of the ship's condition showed that they had dearly needed this delay. Repairs would not be completed for several days. Practically everyone had been bruised or shaken up. Oberfield had a fractured skull and was in serious condition. Ferrati had broken his leg and pelvis. Shea had a couple of cracked ribs. The men were given emergency medical treatment and confined to quarters. The Magellan quietly circled Pluto once every hour and a half, and the ship tried to resume its normal life. Russ studied the surface beneath them, Haines and Burl at his elbow. Then, after conferring, the three approached Lockhart. "We want permission to make a landing," Russ said. "If we take the four-man rocket plane, we can make the ground safely. We've got to reconnoiter before we can figure out how to put this Masters sun tap station out of business." Lockhart agreed. "I was planning as much. Now that we're here, we can't delay just because we're injured. Go ahead." The three got ready quickly. They donned their spacesuits, loaded the larger rocket plane with equipment, arms, and plenty of extra fuel. Just before they left, Lockhart gave them a word of caution. "Do not attempt to communicate with the Magellan by radio. If Pluto is the sun tapper's home world, you may find yourself surrounded by enemies and overheard. Don't reveal our existence or position. If you have to talk to us, do not expect a reply unless it's an absolute emergency." Burl strapped himself into his seat within the rocket plane and glanced through the thick window. Below them was a world the size of Earth, a world which, if it had air and warmth, could most nearly be Earth's twin of all the planets in the system. The rocket plane had touched on the hot surface of Mercury, the first planet. In a little while it would set down on the frigid surface of the last planet. They had come a long way. End of chapter 16.